The southern bank of the River Ouse in central York is dominated by two buildings from the second half of the 20th century. There is perhaps no better example to tell the story of the critical 50 years of British architecture, and it's far deeper than just calling them ugly. I think it's vitally important that everybody understands the story behind this architecture and how it relates to the struggles of our recent ancestors. Firstly, and so importantly, this part of York was completely gutted during the Second World War, specifically in the April 1942 Baedeker air raids of York. This is when the most historic cities all around the UK were bombed, and York was one of them. Before this, the original Rowntree's factory stood here, an icon of British confectionery. They did have their main building at the time, and it was of course Rowntree's who created the Kit Kat, the Aero, Fruit Pastels, Smarties, and many more world famous trees. But the war pretty much saw an end to this building, and that's a vitally important part of this story. There are 4 reasons which can be attributed directly to the Second World War that help explain why we see these radical modern buildings across Britain. Firstly, 75,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Britain during the war from 1940 onwards. This devastated many English cities, office buildings destroyed, homes destroyed, industrial buildings destroyed, all of which needed building back, and quickly. Secondly, modernism in architecture has existed for over 100 years, but it was during the 1930s that modern architects from occupied Europe migrated to Britain due to their persecution at the hands of a regime that hated modern architecture, as you probably know. Thirdly, as a result of the horrors of war, many British people, and across the world as well, wanted a fresh start. They wanted a different future to look forward to, so they were now far more open to radically different art, literature, philosophy, and of course, architecture. There was also the rise of sci-fi in this period, an exciting new genre that gave ordinary people optimism. Looking at these buildings now, after decades of looking at them, yes, to most of us, not all of us, most of us, they do look ugly. But put yourself in the shoes of a generation that had never seen the like before, and they saw hope in futurism. In wider society as a whole, traditionalism was on the way out, and modernism was on the way in. Lastly, there was of course the impact of the war on the British Treasury. Resources were depleted, we nearly went bankrupt, and it became known as the Age of Austerity. There was also the fact that Britain had lost a large amount of its workforce during the war years. So, desperate times call for radical answers, and that is exactly what we got. We needed buildings, and we needed them quickly. Now was not the time for ornamentation, now was the time for functionality. Lives were at stake, lives of heroes who had survived the war. There was no time for making new housing estates look like the Houses of Parliament. They just needed to build homes in these new war-torn cities. New innovative technologies of construction in the use of glass, steel and concrete were the most cost-efficient ways of building Britain back. This was no longer decoration, this was survival, so cost efficiency was paramount. The motto was now form follows function, and the main priority for architects was how to most practically use the given space, not how to make the space look as ornate as possible. That is also why we started to see buildings become taller and taller as we built into the sky, and people were enthusiastic about this new style, which represented a possible new Britain, especially with the rise of the welfare state bringing large-scale public housing projects. The new radical modern style took hold of architecture schools and town planning departments across the entire country. So after the war, modernism in architecture flourished. Estates were springing up everywhere, government buildings were springing up in the style, problems were being met with this new innovative technology. However, we were obviously not in the post-war austerity age forever. As time went on, the necessity for such radically cost-effective construction methods decreased, and the novelty of this great new style also decreased. Simultaneously, the critics increased, most of all from one member of the British royal family. This 10-storey hotel on North Street was opened on the 1st of January 1969. It was actually the first hotel built in York for 90 years and represented the city's steps into the modern tourist industry. This was pure modernism, and to this day it is the second tallest building in York, behind only the Minster, because legally you cannot build taller than the Minster. It was soon after the opening that the public doubts regarding post-war modernist architecture started to creep in. King Charles has always hated modernist architecture, and I mean hated, but in the 70s he was on a rampage. He described the 1976 National Theatre as looking more like a nuclear power station, and the 1973 British Library as more like a place for burning books. But his words represented a growing community of people across Britain. Critics were asking, we don't have to build like this anymore, so why do we? Their main point of criticism was that these buildings made no attempt whatsoever to assimilate into the cultural identity of the city that they stood in. Different eras of architecture can be seen across the whole of York. It's what makes York so beautiful. But this was different. This was a statement of power and domination. It was egotistical, standing by the river here. Critics saw the international style of rectangles and blocks as soulless and cold and alienating to the locals of York who were used to such classical beauty. These were not York buildings. These types of buildings could be found anywhere on the planet. Ironically, the hotel was named the Viking Hotel in an attempt to establish some sort of connection to York, as York was of course the capital of Danelaw after the Vikings had invaded Britain. In the end, most people saw the building as nothing more than an invasion on the city's historic skyline. Historians John Hutchinson and David Palliser comment that the painfully solid building dominates so many views without contributing to any. Nikolaus Pevsner describes the building as intrusive. There were, of course, and still are, a lot of people who like modern and brutal architecture, which is something that should always be taken into consideration. But this is not debate or me sharing my views. Regardless of your current views on it, public feelings regarding this radical style of architecture were changing, which brings us further up the street. When I made a post about this building on Instagram a couple months back, many people at first thought this was the MI6 building on the Thames in London. It's obviously not, though they were built within a couple of years of each other, but the designs are completely different. See, 24 years had passed since the building of the Viking Hotel. Post-war modernism had come to an end, postmodernism had popped up, and many other different architectural styles too after that, such as critical regionalism and contextual modernism, lots of different names. I'm not a qualified architect to go into detail for you, but what certainly happened was a shift to a more locally contextual style from the placelessness of the international style. Modern buildings were still being built, of course, but after learning from the buildings such as the Viking Hotel, they were being built with the city's cultural heritage in mind. This building was opened in 1993 for the General Accident Insurance Company, which went on to become the headquarters of Aviva after a series of mergers, and Aviva still occupy the building today. But this was not the original design. Lead architect Brian Paul initially proposed a very modern building with informal tumble-down masonry cubes, but feelings had changed. York Civic Trust, the city's official membership organisation that seeks to protect the historic fabric of York, successfully campaigned for a wholly traditional exterior, something that would have never happened 25 years prior. As a result, you can see the mullioned windows, and it utilises the same magnesian limestone as the Minster. The gabled roofline also mirrors the medieval Guildhall across the Ouse, which is a beautiful historic building. But this building too did not come without its critics. Peter Davey from the Architectural Review describes it as a meaningless jumble of forms and volumes and a prime example of widespread architectural malaise. He saw the stone facade as wrapping paper on the steel structure, saying the building was an exercise in scenery designing rather than architecture. It is in fact just the facade that was built in this style. It's very modern inside, and even the back of the building, which you can see from Tanner's Row, is normal modern red brick. So it is a case of facadism. The building most definitely splits opinion, and I'd love to know what you guys think. Personally, I like it, and I think it will only improve with time. As a young kid seeing this building from Leadenhall Bridge, I hated it, but my opinions have definitely changed on this. So the moral of the story is that everything is of its time. Everything has its critics. Everything has its supporters. This is the beauty of architecture in historic British places like York. There really is something for everyone.